What's up, Outliers? Welcome back to the Outlier podcast. I'm my friend Doomberg, and the timing for this is beautiful because, as per usual, there's no shortage of crazy things going on. I always find my inability to fill out the stock market and economic bingo cards to be pretty hilarious. I never really get that far. How's the year starting off for you?
Well, it must be said that Donald Trump is nothing if not fantastic for the newsletter business.
I was joking with my wife about that because it's like, to your exact point, if nothing else, you have no shortage of constant streams of clips of things to talk about. Because I was watching him signing like a bunch of different executive orders, and he's given like a press conference while he's signing these things.
You know, we have a good friend, Sir JJ, over at Market Vibes, a new Substack who I like a lot. He's an old school trader, 50 years in the pit.
Yep.
In a recent piece that he published under his masthead, he had an interesting comparison, which is FDR's fireside chats. You know, in a way, Trump is playing the media in the same way that FDR did, totally accessible for all of his faults, and believe me, he has many.
Yep.
The man has stamina and endurance and is never afraid of the microphone. And the contrast between 4 years of a staff trying to hide Joe Biden from the public and Donald Trump unabashedly afraid to talk to a bunch of microphones at 2 a.m. on a return flight from California is really quite something.
It's a stark contrast. So talk to me a little bit about, from an overall lens, how the year is starting off. Were things so far in line with expectations? Were there new injects to the mental models in terms of just how you expected things to go? And I'm not really isolating to one level of analysis: economic, markets, political, really just anything in general. The main reason why I'm asking it this way is I want to get a sense from your paradigm, what's sticking out to you so far this year?
Yeah, the only thing that matters is the speed and efficiency with which Trump is hitting the ground and smashing the opposition. Whatever your views are, whether you are, right-leaning, left-leaning, Donald Trump had 4 years to ponder what went wrong, how he, quote unquote, lost 2020, how his first administration was sidelined by distraction after distraction and perhaps sabotage from within. And he had 4 years to plot his revenge. And he ascended to the presidency on January 20th. And it is just simply undeniable that he is flooding the field with all manner of good policy, crazy policy, insane statements. The news cycle can't keep up with whatever it is he's rolling out. And, he's deputized Elon Musk to do a variety of things. And he's getting his nominees through the Senate, making crazy statements with Netanyahu at this press conference. He's just a whirlwind. And again, whatever your views on the man or his politics or his morals, he is a tornado. Yep. that is impacting everything. He's impacting stocks, he's impacting geopolitics, he's impacting war, he's impacting peace, he's impacting the tax code, he's impacting the federal government budget. He is just a steamroller, the likes of which the U.S., frankly, I don't think has ever seen. And history will record Trump, regardless of how his term ends, as a tour de force. Whether it ends up being net positive or negative, of course, depends on future events and depends on your perspective coming into these events. But the man is undeniably just an Energizer bunny of just unlike we've never seen it. Maybe it's just the contrast between what Trump would characterize as the Sleepy Joe administration. But it just really is something to behold. And frankly, we are having trouble keeping up with it all, trying to chronicle it and trying to bring some sense to it. But it's nothing if not interesting, to be sure.
Yeah, so far you bring up a really interesting point about just how much is going on. Of the just litany of policies, executive orders, statements that are being made, are there any specific items that he's been talking about that really stick out to you? And if so, why?
So there's the assault on U.S. aid or USAID, depending on your perspective. And that is really just going right at the jugular of the power structure of the Democratic National Committee. And somebody gave Trump really good advice before he came into the presidency the second time around. So there's the proactive things he's actually doing. And look, that's a scandal. Like, I mean, I think that is really going to be a major story for months to come as we see all of these foreign quote unquote newspapers and media outlets suddenly going out of business because they were actually just paid fronts of the Democratic Party of the United States. Opposition media in Hungary, for example, is just one example where Viktor Orban was tweeting about recently. So there's the things he's doing, but then there's the things he's not doing, which I think are just as important and just as
Oh,
profound,
interesting.
which is what we're trying to get our hands around to write a few pieces on, which is he really doesn't want anything to do with Ukraine. I mean, I think this is Biden's war. Don't forget, Trump was impeached over Ukraine in 2019. It's not like he's unaware of what's really going on over there and how this all came about. And he would like to just wash his hands of it, turn the keys over to Europe, which of course is akin to losing the war because there is no way in which Ukraine can sustain itself in the absence of continued U.S. support. And he just doesn't actually want to talk about it. The stuff he does say when asked is mostly wrong. Sort of indicates to us that he's not really studying the issue all that closely. It's kind of like that issue in the back of your mind that you know is there that you wish would just go away, and so you don't spend much time thinking about it, which is sort of consistent with Trump's personality because he gravitates towards winning and strength and all of those things. Like we're losing that war, NATO will lose that war, Russia will win that war, and he's kind of just trying to drop the bags on Europe. And one of the pieces we're working on right now is how this amazing interview that Marco Rubio gave with Megyn Kelly, where he all but says that the U.S. will retreat to a sphere of influence slash multipolar world. There's no scenario in which the European Union survives an American retreat in that regard, and that's what's coming. Rubio all but signaled it. Trump's absence of forceful, for all the talk of I'm going to solve the war in a day and I'm going to call Putin and we're going to negotiate a deal. He's done none of those things, and I can understand why. He was dealt a losing hand. We've said many times in our articles and on podcast appearances that one of the reasons why you avoid picking fights is you might lose them. And this is especially true when the cost of defeat is larger than the prize on offer, And so he just wants to ignore Ukraine. And every day that he ignores Ukraine, the Russian army continues to sort of roll up the parts of Ukraine that it now considers Russia. And Zelensky gets more and more desperate. It's a real fiasco, one for which the blame lies at the feet of the Biden administration, to be clear. I think with a high degree of certainty that Trump's statements that the war would not have happened if he had won in 2020 are absolutely true. We would not be involved in this war. And so it's not just what he's doing, but what he's not doing. And he is really taking a frontal assault on the vast waste and fraud and mismanagement of public money that has occurred in Washington under the auspices of both Democratic and Republican regimes. In our view, there's Team DC and Team Trump, and DC is about to get rinsed.
Couple things here. The first one, going back to the Ukraine war, two questions. The first one is you're hypothesizing that Russia is likely to win. When you say win, what does that mean? Like, how would you define Russia winning in this context?
Russia will impose its objectives by military force, and there is nothing that Europe or the US can do about it. That is my definition of winning. It will secure the quote 4 regions. It will degrade Ukraine's military capabilities. It might not be able to enforce upon Ukraine that the Russians that live within what's left of Ukraine get, the rights to speak their language and go to church and all of those things. But the broad, important military objectives will be achieved by force, which is sort of the ultimate definition of winning in a military conflict, as I'm sure you more than anybody would be aware.
Yep. And the follow-on is, why do you think Trump is taking such a passive position on it? Obviously, understanding the context of being dealt kind of a difficult hand to work with, but that also seems like a really great potential win for him and his platform.
He doesn't have the leverage to win, and Trump hates to be seen as losing. Right? I mean, I don't want to be like armchair psychologist.
Sure.
but he is a relatively straightforward person to understand, right? He is, I think, a very empathetic person, a very patriotic person, a very bombastic person. Um, he enjoys a good negotiation, the art of the deal, wrote a book on it, and I think has very good intuition for when he is walking into a situation where he doesn't have the leverage. And since he didn't create this situation, but he only inherited it, I think the motivation, like in his first 100 days, he wants to be seen as winning as much as possible, and this is just a losing hand.
And
And so I just think passive aggressively, he wants to ignore it.
what makes you think so much that it's a losing hand?
I don't know. I've been studying the day-to-day, line of combat moves and what both sides are telling themselves internally for propaganda and body counts and all the things that you would want to study to get your own independent analysis of what's going on the ground. And this is very hard. We wrote a piece a year ago called Mapping the War, and we opened that piece with the difficulty involved in cutting through propaganda. And one of the things we have learned to do, which I think serves us very well, is we read the propaganda of all the sides. Because even just learning what they're telling each other is a very valuable input into what's possible and what's likely happening. And we're seeing, look, it's just the mathematics of it are very clear. Like you have a giant country next to a relatively small country. You have a vast industrial machine that the West radically underestimated. I don't know why, for centuries, invading armies always underestimate the industrial capacity of Russia. Their supply chain is far closer to the line of combat than ours. It is viewed internally within Russia and is spun as much within their propaganda as an existential threat to the country. It's a nice to have war for us. You go to the Midwest and you go to the mall and you ask 100 people, do you care about Ukraine? I bet you wouldn't find a single yes. If you go to the same mall in Moscow, it's an existential threat. So you have one side fighting existentially, the Russians, for whom their entire industrial base is right there. And then the US, through its sort of proxies in the EU, with very long extended supply chains, much of which has been outsourced to China, by the way, who is allied with our opponent in this war. This is highlighting huge weaknesses in the U.S. military-industrial complex, which I think Trump is motivated to fix. And in many ways, this has opened the eyes of, I think, the Department of Defense, which is we would sort of view Washington as the DoD largely pro-Trump and CIA, Wall Street largely pro-Biden. The DoD recognizes the holes in its supply chain, doesn't really want to escalate the war in Ukraine, and sees that it's just a fight that we can't win. Like we've spent how many tens of billions of dollars on this war, and if you just go to the Deep State Mapping Project and play the video of the movement of the line of combat over the last year, it's very clear that it's a one-way traffic. And so Russia's army's never been bigger. It's never been better equipped. The head of NATO just admitted that Russia is producing 3 times as many weapons as the entirety of the NATO countries integrated by a factor of 3. We're not going to win this war. We're not going to resort to nuclear, weapons. That's pretty clear. And so if one of the reasons why you don't pick a kinetic conflict with a nuclear superpower is unless you're willing to use your nuclear weapons, they're not much use to you. So I just think the writing's on the wall. And especially if Trump pulls away, we've cut off funding and a few other things. Like it won't be long, and so I just think sometimes you just got to take the L, and Trump is probably willing to take that L. Because by the way, it's very hard. Like, how would you win this war from here if you were in charge, Eric? I'd be curious. Like, I don't see how we can do it. We've exhausted a huge amount of our weaponry. We're more concerned about China, really, than Russia. And I think Trump is provably more concerned about China than Russia. So I just don't see it. And by the way, if you're going to lose, and once everybody sort of understands that you're going to lose, these things tend to collapse pretty quickly.
Yeah. No, I think you have an interesting perspective. I think the only follow-up I would have there then is, why is the war still going? If Russia is this giant superpower, it's super close to the line of conflict, it has this industrial complex, it can steamroll Ukraine, and yet the war is going on
So
still.
two reasons. From the Russian side, Putin is genuinely interested in minimizing Russian casualties. So slow, steady, don't let your troops outrun your drone coverage. And by the way, he has stated his military objectives, which is the four regions, which
Mhm.
he now considers Russia. And then on the Ukrainian side, Zelensky has no room to maneuver, right? I mean, you have this far right, Banda right portion of Ukraine, which has zero desire for compromise and would rather sort of die trying to push the Russians out. And the moment Zelensky takes a step towards compromise, I think his personal position would be um, very precarious. Um, Losing wars is hard. Like if you just look through history, admitting that you have been defeated early enough to salvage something reasonable from the situation is almost impossible. And putting leaders in such positions is a no-win situation for them. And so a slow grind that ultimately inevitably ends in total defeat is sort of a boiled frog, situation for those on the losing side of war. Again, picking wars, we should have a very, very high barrier to like getting involved in wars because you could lose them. As Colin Powell says, if you don't have a plan up front for overwhelming victory, what are you doing? We had no such plan from the beginning. Like, there was no scenario where we were going to impose a kinetic defeat on Russia from afar. Maybe we were naive enough to think that from the beginning, but after the first few months, it should have been clear that that was unlikely to happen. Certainly after the large counteroffensive from Ukraine was defeated by Russia. At that point, the war is over. And again, if you just go back through history, Eric, like Napoleon, you know, pick your favorite. Like people roll into Russia, and then what happens? They get ground down to a pulp. Russia is not afraid to fight a war of attrition and to win them. So that's where we are. I think that's, by the way, not a controversial opinion anymore. We may have been early to that opinion, but I think that's broadly, if you just read The Economist and the Financial Times and the British papers, they're starting to come around to the fact that maybe this war is not winnable and we should begin to sort of salvage what's left. But it's very difficult to lose a war. Losing a war in a way that minimizes the totality of negativity on your country takes a level of statesmanship that is very, very rare. And by the way, statesmanship involves convincing the people you lead to go along with it. And sometimes it's just impossible. So, it's a terrible situation. The biggest losers in all of this, by far, like scandalously so, are the people of Ukraine. The U.S. can wash its hands of it. Trump could wash his hands of it, and there might be some mild political price to pay in the U.S. But compared to what has happened to the people of Ukraine, this has been a calamity, true calamity, one for which people should be held to account.
And one last question on this one, while we're on it. I'm trying to understand your perspective on Trump's preference to potentially let this one go, with it being such a massive global focus and such a massive part of his campaign. I would see it hard to look at it any other way than a colossal failure on Trump's scorecard. If
So, yeah, yep, go ahead.
no, that's, I think you got it.
Yeah, so first of all, it's early for him, right? And if he puts enough W's on the board, maybe he can wash away an L or two. But I actually think more likely is, for all the talk of a Trump-Putin meeting, I think there's going to be a Trump-Putin-Xi summit, where big, broad spheres of influence are delineated. And Trump gets concessions in other areas and cedes Ukraine. And again, anybody from Ukraine listening to this will be quite angered by me characterizing it in this way, and I fully understand that. I'm just trying to get into Trump's head. I'm not telling you what I would do. And I think there's going to be some grand bargain. Look, what has Trump focused on since he became president? Ukraine, Panama, Canada, Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, Western Hemisphere, spheres of influence, Monroe Doctrine. Ukraine's not on the board. It's a true tragedy. I'm not trying to downplay it. It is a catastrophe. But in a world where Trump and Xi and Putin get together and decide the world for the next 40 years, it's not like we're going to be able to convince Putin to turn around and just hand back Ukraine to Europe. I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think as traders, as investors, as analysts, you have to see the pieces on the board as they are and play them accordingly.
Sure. Yeah. One last question on this one, and then I actually want to pivot to talk to you a little bit about the whole tariff game that's happening. But on the war as it sits, what are your thoughts specifically on the way new technology is essentially reshaping the ability for smaller forces to be able to compete? Because obviously, as you're doing your research on the battle lines, I'm sure you're coming across no shortage of actual live videos or recorded videos of the conflict as it sits. And you see $2,000 of drones knocking out $15 million of equipment. So then it starts to call into question the industrial capacity and the ability to produce, large weapons able of reaching far, a lot of these missile systems and stuff like that. The drones have changed all of that. So how does
100%.
How does that fit into your analysis?
Yeah, so I would say, look, I mean, full credit to Ukraine. I mean, they're the second strongest military in Europe today by a wide margin through the cauldron of having to fight, right? The technological development and the necessity of doing so in order to sort of stay one step ahead of your competitor has made both Russia and Ukraine far stronger technologically than almost any other military in the world. And it's only because Russia is so much bigger and has such a stronger military industrial complex to rely upon, and frankly, more people to entice to join its army, entice being sort of a purposely broad term. Like Russia is a far stronger military force today out of necessity than it was when what Putin would call the special military operation commenced in 2022. Far stronger than America today. And I think China has been studying the situation very carefully. Like Russia has a million-plus strong army, or military, not just army, and they have been sort of trial by fire in the most like brutal, disgusting, horrifying way possible, which is like a war in which a bunch of people die every day. I think like both sides are suffering hundreds of casualties a day. We see the latest evolution of fiber optic controlled drones out of Russia. Have you seen these? Where these super thin wires, like basically a giant fishing line that spans kilometers, and these drones basically can't be interfered with using, electronic weapons. And so they just are flying now with full autonomy all over the battlefield. And I think this has been the most recent of the sort of technological developments that is changing the pace of change on the front line. Because if you can't really use, electronic interference weapons to distort the path and aiming capabilities of these drones, and now you literally have a hardwired drone flying through the air with a super thin fiber optic cable controlling it. That's just the latest innovation that would never have happened if this war hadn't been, fought for the past 3 years. It's amazing, by the way, that we're coming up on 3 years of the war. It's really sad, actually. It's a real indictment of the current slate of Western leaders that we've allowed this thing to go on for as long as we have. But yeah, huge amount of technological development. Old weapons that cost millions of dollars a pop, totally obsolete, right? And then, beyond that, sort of missile development, the Orezhnik missile, which doesn't get much press in the West, but I think really shocked and opened the eyes of NATO. Yeah, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and there's nothing more necessary than trying to win a war. And we're seeing an amazing adaptation of AI and drone technology and all the things that should scare people, autonomous robot technology I've seen some films of. By the way, I should say you don't want to watch too many of these films because there's a lot of like actual real people dying in horrific ways in the footage that you can see online, and every person that you see dying is somebody's kid, somebody's sibling, somebody's cousin, somebody's friend, and it's a real human tragedy, and it can. One thing you don't want to do is ever get sort of normalized to watching such things because it's quite sad.
Can be. Yeah, definitely can be. Really interesting. I enjoy hearing your perspective. There's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of things Yeah, that I think are just a very interesting lens to apply. But I'd love to pivot now and pick your brain a little bit on the game of tariffs that's afoot. Is that how did you think that that was going to play out, and how has it trended so far?
So, not sure if you saw it, but we just wrote about it
Yep.
yesterday. And so it was top of mind for us. And we have a lot of friends and connections to Canada. And we actually take Trump on this issue, we take Trump at face value. The fentanyl crisis is a real issue. We're losing 100,000 people a year to overdoses in the country, which is almost certainly a significant underestimation. 80% of those overdoses are from fentanyl. A lot of those fentanyl overdoses are from people using other drugs, not knowing that fentanyl has been cut in. And so they overdose by accident and they die. This is a chemical war declared upon the US by China that largely targets military aged adults in the country. And it's long past time that we get serious about trying to stop it. Most of the fentanyl that finds its way into the US comes in via Mexico or Canada. And Canadians were shocked and angered and bewildered at being lumped in with Mexico as co-equal participants in the sort of fentanyl trade. But as we wrote in our piece, Undeclared, there's strong circumstantial evidence to support Trump's claims. And the main counter sort of arguments that the Canadian media and the Canadian government have been putting forward don't really pass muster and don't stand up to close scrutiny. And you'll notice, there's sort of this theory that Trump is just a economic arsonist or a madman and Orange Man bad and all this stuff. When he campaigned, he said over and over and over and over again, I will make fentanyl a top priority and I will use tariffs to convince Mexico, China, and Canada to do something about it. That's what he does. If you actually read the executive order that lays the groundwork for these tariffs, it begins with fentanyl. Within 24 hours after he announced the tariffs, both Mexico and Canada pledged to do substantially more on the fentanyl issue. And Trump says, okay, let's delay the tariffs until we can negotiate a permanent settlement. Like, it's very clear. He called a shot. He explained why he was doing it. He did it. The moment he got movement on the main issue that was the driving force for the tariffs, he relented. Like, fentanyl is a real issue. We're losing more people to fentanyl than we lost in the battlefield in World War II. Like, that will shock people to look at that statistic. We lost 400,000 soldiers dead in World War II for the entirety of the war. And we've lost that many people to fentanyl in the last 4 years, 5 years. Like, it's a big deal. It's destroying families and communities across the country. Look, there's a demand side argument to be made, and I get that. But there's more that Canada and Mexico and the US could do. And Trump is well within his rights. And frankly, we applaud to him for finally making this an issue of the highest priority for the US federal government. Like, if not this, then what? Like, we're losing 100,000 people, young people. It's a big deal. And there's far more fentanyl being produced in Canada than the Canadians would like to admit. And beyond that, the Chinese gangs in Canada excel at money laundering, and they've embarked upon a synergistic collaboration with the Mexican cartels to help them turn their drug profits into money good. And this is real, and Trump should be applauded for recognizing. Now, look, the bluntness of tariffs and Trump's sort of style and statements leave a bad taste in some people's mouth. But on this particular issue, we find ourselves wholeheartedly supporting the president.
Yeah, I just like the way you framed the modality, because I agree. It definitely can rub people all different kinds of ways. one of the things that I have to agree with you on broadly, though, is that in order to move things quickly, you kind of have to do things that are a little, I don't know, brash is the right term, but definitely a little heavier handed than the standard bureaucratic process of call a summit, have leaders come talk about it, and so on and so forth. Because to your broader point, think of how fast there are now, Mexico sending, what is it, 10,000 troops, to the Mexico side of the border, just is a loose example.
Same
But
with
that
Canada.
happened,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that happened over the course of 48 hours. So you don't really get speed like that unless you do something a little more drastic. Now, I find an interesting exercise is to think about what the next month might look like, though, and specifically the element that I think your expertise will probably lend in understanding a lot better is, let's say 30 days go by and they're unable to arrive at a conclusion or a deal. I mean, my expectation honestly is that they would, because I think it's in everybody's benefit, but just playing the scenario that maybe they don't. What do you think about the implementation of tariffs, then the retaliatory tariffs from Canada, and how that might shape the broader economic picture, at least in the near term, 3-6 months ish?
Here's why a deal has to happen. Exports from Canada to the US account for 22% of Canadian GDP, and exports of the US to Canada account for 1.5% of US GDP. There's just no leverage on the Canadian side. Like, Trump will dictate the terms, and Canada will follow them. That is the outcome. That is in everybody's economic interest. And if they don't, the tariffs will come on. He'll probably put them up to 50%. There will be a revolution of some kind in Canada, and there'll be a new partner for Trump to negotiate with. On this one, I have many, many close friends and other associates in Canada, and our piece provoked all manner of responses. On this one, Canada would be wise to be seen as doing as much as possible. And by the way, it's an easy off-ramp. Like, who could be opposed to rolling up fentanyl labs in rural British Columbia? Who could be opposed to tightening the border crossings across the rural western part of the country? You're going to pay all those soldiers who will monitor the border anyway. And who could be opposed to cracking down on TD Bank and the money laundering that they've been accused of doing to enable the fentanyl trade? Like, fentanyl is a dastardly drug that all law-abiding citizens should be fully supportive of eradicating from our collective societies. Canada too, by the way. Canada loses 3,000 to 4,000 citizens a year to fentanyl overdose. It's not quite at the same pace, even correcting for relative population, than we see in the US, but it's still material. Every one of those is a tragedy. Every one of those deaths is somebody's kid. And it should be eradicated. And the Mexican cartels and the Chinese cartels are deeply evil people. Like, and we should be fighting them. Mexico, for example, has just huge potential runway, which is a piece we're pondering writing for a variety of reasons, if they could just get their cartel situation under control. And I know it's been that way for decades, and it's a hard problem. But, like, same thing in Canada. Like, look, we have very strong evidence that there are dangerous Chinese organized criminal elements saturating British Columbia and the city of Toronto, mostly, interfering with Canadian elections, causing all manner of crime, blowing the property bubble in Vancouver and Toronto. Like, it used to be that you couldn't say such things without being accused of, xenophobia, but it's true, it's real, everybody knows it's real. Let's get a handle on it. Like, again, one of the things about Trump is he just sort of has a knack for saying sort of loudly and sometimes inappropriately all the things that everybody's thinking quietly. Let's just go ahead and put it on the table and get it fixed.
So then, to summarize that, it sounds like your overarching expectation is arrive at a deal.
It's impossible. Impossible they wouldn't, Eric. I mean, come on. I mean, 22% of your GDP. I mean,
we say that, and to be clear, I actually agree with you. But I mean, what's the point of even starting then with retaliatory tariffs?
Trudeau's lame duck, wants to be seen as strong. This is an injection of uncertainty into an election campaign that was imminent and looked likely to be a deep defeat for the Liberals. If Trudeau could be seen as standing up to the bully and fighting for Canada, then maybe whoever replaces him on the ticket stands a better chance of minimizing the defeat that they look set to suffer to the Conservatives. I mean, there's, people optimize for all kinds of outcomes in situations like this. And look, it gave Trudeau a chance to be relevant again, for one thing.
Mhm.
And to his credit, I think he did actually a pretty good job of handling the situation. It's certainly being portrayed as such in the Canadian media, which I follow closely. And you know, as we articulated in the piece, which we thought was pretty balanced, um, this this move by Trump sparked a rare moment of national political unity across Canada, which is not to be ignored and isn't inconsequential. And so it changed the game. Like the least happy person is Pierre Poilievre, you know, like waiting to ascend to the throne of Prime Minister of Canada, then suddenly the entire rules of the game change. That's not good. When you have a winning hand, you want stability, and this is a deeply destabilizing event. When you have a losing hand, instability is a potential opportunity. And so, and look, Trudeau handled it well. He relied on, you know, there's these sort of Council of U.S. Relations within Canada, and Lord knows within Canada, the stance and negotiation towards the United States is probably the most important political issue on the board. And Trudeau, again, to his credit, handled the situation quite well. And look, I'm no fan of Trudeau. Like we've written very critically about Trudeau over the years, especially his sort of totalitarian instincts around the Freedom Convoy and all that stuff. But in this particular case, isolated to the event at issue, Trudeau comes out looking pretty good, in my view.
One of the things I noticed when the tariffs are coming out, I have a bunch of people in my audience that are Canadian, and you could definitely tell that there's a lot of people that were just kind of like pissed off about it, right? It felt like,
100%, yeah.
yeah, it felt like our neighbor is being lame, and why is it like this? And one of the arguments I saw posed that was pretty interesting was the fact that Canada represents a really significant portion, and this is right up your alley, of U.S. heavy oil imports. So
Yeah.
not crude, but sand oil. And the US doesn't really have deep production of that in place just yet. I think that there are different ways that the US would manage through it. But just to play out the scenario, because it's an interesting thought exercise, tariffs, let's say 30 days, for whatever reason, the impossibility does occur and they don't arrive at an agreement. Maybe it's political, maybe it's part of to your broader point, part of this broader election, whatever the scenario is. And let's just say that the scenario escalated somehow to where Canada says we are going to cut sending you heavy oils. Now, I think that that's kind of suicide for Canada, but just for the lens of the US, how does something like that impact the US? And how do you think the US would navigate through that kind of decision?
I'm going to give you an answer that'll surprise you.
Hmm.
Canadians are vastly, vastly overestimating the leverage that we sell the U.S. heavy oil brings to them. Refiners who are optimized to refine heavy crude prefer to refine heavy crude because they have made the investments necessary to take sulfur out of heavy crude, and heavy crude tends to be cheaper. That doesn't mean that they can't refine other crude. And so there's this thought that if Canada shuts off the spigots, that somehow the US will find itself in a refined products crisis. And that's just not true. We, the US, I live in the US, the US exports light crude and imports heavy crude because the newest refineries out there prefer to refine light crude, and the old refineries here prefer to refine heavy crude. It doesn't mean they couldn't make do with the light crudes that we have. It'd be suboptimal. You know, they might not run at full capacity, and some of their operational units might be idled. But in the long run, the U.S., which has, by the way, massive stores of these refined products and could go many, many weeks with, you know, while the refiners retooled and work through the inventory they have online. Like this is compared to the 22% of your GDP being reliant on U.S. exports, this is no leverage at all. And these are the happy stories you tell yourself when you have no leverage. Again, I'm sort of reminded of Ukraine. The U.S. would be in a far better place to handle a slowdown in the imports, or even a complete cessation of the imports of heavy crude from Canada, It would be suboptimal. People wouldn't make as much money, but the U.S. gas pumps would not run dry. Um, and by the way, it would accelerate the necessary investments needed to optimize the U.S. refinery fleet for light grades, which would then permanently reduce any leverage, fleeting as it might be, that Canada might have. And so when I see such commentary in the media, I cringe because it tells me that the people actually don't know what they're talking about, and that it might inform political leaders to make decisions based on leverage they think they have that doesn't actually exist. Um, the U.S. petroleum industry is exceptionally sophisticated, and they aren't trapped in some like, oh my God, we need Canadian heavy crude. We'd like to buy Canadian heavy crude at a discount. WCS is a discount. And why should I pay up to buy this light crude that others in foreign lands are willing to pay up for when I could buy my cheap crude here and capture a bigger spread when I sell my gasoline and my jet fuel and my diesel? That there's a vast difference between economic optimization and economic necessity. And this is a card that I think is wildly over exaggerated in the Canadian media today, to the Canadians' detriment. Yeah.
Yep. I fully agree with that one. And the other part that I was doing a little bit of research on is just even if if the US needed to find some sort of short-term replacement, there are other places that produce heavy crude as well.
Sure.
It's
It's
not at the
globally
same
traded.
scale, but
Yeah, right. It's globally.
yeah.
You would just turn the spigots on in Venezuela. I mean, Mexico, but like it's produced all over the world. It's floating around in cargo ships. If we truly needed it, we could just pay up and buy it. The U.S. is not going to run out of gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel because Canada turns off the taps. It just isn't.
Yeah.
The U.S. is a global energy superpower, and the reorientation of the system, given the price disparities that would temporarily materialize, would only further erode Canada's leverage over time.
Right. Now, speaking of energy and just what that might look like for the year, we obviously talked last time about some of Trump's policies about, drill baby drill and the different things that we might expect to see from an energy evolution standpoint. But I'd love to get an update on any key energy themes that you guys are seeing and expect to play out this year.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Wright just, elevated to the Secretary of Energy, which was a big vote that we were watching very carefully earlier this week. He's taking aggressive action to implement Trump's agenda. I'm looking at the board right now, and I see WTI at $70.50, basically at the low end of OPEC's desired managed range. Saudi Arabia needs 95 to 105 to balance its budget. That's sort of the financial break-even price of Saudi Arabia. OPEC is on its back foot. I note with great interest that the envoy that Trump sent to Venezuela seemed to have pretty good success in freeing some U.S. hostages, in air quotes. I don't know what they were up to in Venezuela, but they have since been released. And other concessions being made by Venezuela. I'd keep a close eye on Chevron's desire to get a license renewed to continue to operate in Venezuela. Trump seems to be playing the Monroe Doctrine. This whole concept that we need to increase production in the U.S. for Trump to achieve his objectives, which is $40 oil to sort of put pressure on Putin and maybe get a better deal in Ukraine, misses the fact that there are other ways for Trump to increase global oil production right here in the Western Hemisphere, Guyana, Venezuela, Argentina. I'd keep a close eye on Colombia, which seems to be taking a pretty combative stance towards Trump. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see regime change there sometime this year. A very interesting situation to follow. So there's plenty to do at home. And Trump has signaled that he's interested in doing those things at home. And it's not just the U.S. I mean, if ExxonMobil radically increases drilling and production in Guyana, how is that different than the Permian Basin increasing production, right? I mean, it's an American company, leading a joint venture, which actually, by the way, includes a Chinese company, increasing global supply of oil. The Chinese are interested in lower oil prices too. And so, I just think looking at the board right now, oil hugging the bottom end of the preferred managed range of OPEC, hard to see what the catalysts are for significant upside from here.
Interesting. And I know they got to run in a couple minutes. Two more questions. The first one is looking at the global stage right now, obviously, there's so much talk about, you know, Canada, Mexico, Russia, Ukraine. And you mentioned earlier an important player that just has seemed to have kind of been a little more quiet until the tariff conversation earlier this week, and that's China. So, where does China fit into the broader mix, the broader global and geopolitical scale, as you can see, just from like a current thematic perspective?
I think China is playing its cards exceptionally well, as it always does. I think it's a serious error to underestimate your geopolitical opponents. I think if Marco Rubio is indeed out there talking about spheres of influence and multipolarity, this is music to Chinese ears. They have been the arsenal in support of Russia's imminent victory in Ukraine. And between those two countries and the great catastrophic geopolitical disaster of driving them together that happened in the last 4 years, which is something the US has tried to avoid for decades, by the way. This strong cohesion between Russia and China is going to be a formidable competitor to the US in a new multipolar world. And I think China is emboldened to gradually take back Taiwan in the way that it wants to, which is without armed conflict. And I don't know what Trump can do in a world where that begins to happen, because it's not like we can project enough power from here to there, especially when China controls so much of our military industrial supply chains. And especially as we've learned in Russia, that proximity to the battlefield is really determinative. And there's nobody closer to Taiwan than China. I mean, by definition, it's right there. So Xi is sitting back. The nice thing from China's perspective, not necessarily from ours, but if you're China, you don't have an urgency. You don't have that 4-year electoral cycle. You don't have the need to be seen as doing something consequential in your first 100 days. China thinks in decades. It has all of the cards. By doing nothing, it continues to win. I expect it to keep doing nothing. Like, why would it provoke a war over Taiwan now when it could just continuously and gradually and incrementally achieve its objectives in a way that doesn't disrupt its economy and doesn't force it to fight? And next thing you know, wake up one day and it's checkmate. And I think that's what they're going to do. I think Xi would certainly attend a summit between Putin and Trump, if for no other reason that they would know that it's 2-on-1. And I think China and Russia have a pretty good read on Trump, by the way, his ego and what drives him and what his needs are and how they could jujitsu those needs for their own objectives. I mean, if you're just being objective and you take a step back, like, Trump is not really a complicated guy. And so it's going to be fascinating to see. We, of course, are nothing more than interested observers. But I think China has its own challenges internally, and people point to them all the time, although the same people point to various challenges in Russia that never seem to materialize in anything meaningful. Demographics and the property bust and all that other stuff. I don't know. It kind of reminds me of the peachy bull guys, anxiously looking for well depletion rates in the Permian for proof that we're about to fall off the cliff in global oil production. But nonetheless, I would say that my own personal history in dealing with and being in and around China in my industrial career, they're not to be taken lightly. They play the game on a horizon that is longer than ours. They're infinitely patient. They're more than happy to take the freebies, the freebies, as we toss them up, and then wait for the next one, and we shall see. But I think the odds of a sort of kinetic conflict over Taiwan, I think, are going down with each passing day, as it becomes apparent that that would just be sort of a losing battle. So, and I think that's their objective. Nobody should want war. The Chinese haven't really started a war that I can remember in modern history. And so why would they want us to provoke one now over the Taiwan issue?
Definitely. And I think, well, I agree with the element of like supply chains and stuff like that, that actually is one of the hallmarks of US military, is our ability to project power. And we've spent a lot of resources developing carrier strike groups and things like that. And that's not to weigh in whether or not that's the deciding factor between winning a conflict wrapped around Taiwan or not. But to your broader point, that's just the path of more resistance for everybody. And it looks like in the US, we're starting to try to incentivize more domestic chip production. And if that happens, then the stake in Taiwan from the US perspective starts to wane and, so on and so forth.
So let me ask you a question. Do you think a U.S. carrier strike group could resist an Oreshnik missile attack today? And do you
Yeah.
think that you actually think that? I could be interested to
Yeah.
see. I
I
don't.
do.
We could agree to disagree.
Yeah.
But if they can't, that's a game changer. You would agree, right? Like, if
Certainly.
if
Yeah.
hypersonic missiles can penetrate the anti-missile shields of U.S. carrier groups, then U.S. carrier groups become a lot less relevant. So, I mean, you would certainly have more experience in this space than I do. But I would be, let's put it this way: if Russia and China believe that they can't, I think that we're heading for a conflict. Right? And
Sure.
so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So,
it's like the same thing when China was touting their 6th-gen fighter, which is a glorified 5th-gen fighter. So
and replete with stolen technology, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah. But all right, you got to run. You got some stuff to do. Absolutely awesome connecting. It's always just fascinating, having a chance to pick your brain a little bit, learn about the world around us. Obviously, people can find you at your website. Anywhere else that you would like to send people to check out your stuff?
Just Doomberg.com, Doomberg. Everything we do is there. We're a one-stop shop. Eric, always a pleasure. One thing that we never fail to do is to speculate and to have a lot of fun brainstorming. So I always appreciate coming on because you ask great questions and we always have a great discussion.
Awesome. Thanks for coming to hang out. Hey, everybody.